Thanks so much, Julianne. Thanks to everyone who's participated in this absolutely fascinating class called Knowing and Believing, an almost interdisciplinary class that brings together many different perspectives associated with the humanities. The class was organized by Barbara Minot, and we've had some fascinating speakers. Just to resume, we had a presentation on perspectives on lying, Adam and Eve and the knowledge of good and evil, science versus pseudoscience, data, algorithms, and everyday life, belief and knowledge during novel challenges, the 19th century cholera epidemics. And today, we're going to hear about skepticism and certainty in the Enlightenment. Our speaker today is Anton Matytsin. He is the Associate Professor of History at the University of Florida. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2013 and was Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the humanities at Stanford University from 2013 to 2015. Prior to coming to the UF, he was assistant professor of history at Kenyon College, where my daughter attended, and a fellow at the National Humanities Center. Professor Matytsin is the author of The Specter of Skepticism in the Age of Enlightenment. He's also co-editor of 2 books. First, with Dan Endelstein, Let There Be Enlightenment, The Religious and Mystical Sources of Rationality. And the second with Jeffrey Burson, The Age of Skepticism, Doubt and Certainty in the Age of Reason. He's currently working on a book that's expected to be entitled A History of History, the Académie des Inscriptions and the Remaking of the Past. Professor Matytsin.
Thanks so much. Can you all hear me okay? Can you all hear me on Zoom? Excellent. And
ready for me to share?
Yeah.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready. Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here. When I got the invitation, I thought it would be a great opportunity to speak to you all about my first book, The Specter of Skepticism, and the edited volume that Rick mentioned, The Skeptical Enlightenment, both of which seem to fit kind of perfectly into the theme of the class of knowing and believing. I tried to eliminate any jargon from my talk, but please let me know if any terms of concepts appear in need of kind of further explication, and we obviously have Q&A at the end, but if something seems kind of totally unclear, just feel free to raise your hand, and I'll gladly elaborate. My students do it all the time. So I'll start with a series of rhetorical questions, because that was one of the ways to start a talk, right? Have you ever wondered how we know what we know about the world around us? Does our perception of reality correspond to something outside the mind? Or maybe everything we see around us is merely an illusion? I think it was, what was the joke with that? If that's the case, then I've certainly overpaid for my carpet. Have you ever questioned your own existence or inquired into the nature of your personal identity? Well, Enlightenment thinkers try to articulate answers to these and many other puzzling questions. We often think about the Enlightenment as an age of reason during which kind of secular rationality completely vanquished superstition. But this period in European history was actually overrun with doubts and uncertainties. It was an age of intellectual flux and dynamism. No question was off the table, and everything seemed up for debate. So philosophers of this period were preoccupied with defining the powers and limits of the human understanding. They questioned whether people could know anything with certainty, from the nature of colors to the reality of the external world, and even to the very existence of the self. And many thinkers tried to distinguish between matters that could be productively debated and questions that were simply beyond the reach of the human understanding. Now, in comic book accounts of the Enlightenment, we learn that, and of modern philosophy, we learn that French thinker René Descartes, the so-called father of modern philosophy, kind of an 18th century invention itself, about Descartes, established new grounds for certainty and overthrew the yoke of medieval Aristotelian philosophy in the mid-1600s. However, although Descartes aimed to create a new and indubitable philosophical foundation for human knowledge, he actually ended up unsettling a relatively stable European learned culture that would lead to a crisis of certainty. By breaking the monopoly that Aristotelian philosophy had held on European higher education for several centuries, Descartes and his disciples, known as Cartesians, opened the floodgates of philosophical uncertainty. Descartes' disciples quabbled and debated with other inventors of rival metaphysical systems, and they all began to compete in this kind of open field for intellectual primacy among a rapidly expanding reading public, proposing different explanations of what the surrounding world was like and how we come to know it. So late 17th and early 18th century intellectuals argued intensely about the structure of the universe, the composition of matter, the relationship between mind and body, and most significantly, they argued about the correct methods for answering all of those questions with any degree of certainty. And these debates often led thinkers to doubt everything they had believed to be true and certain. So by the early 1700s, as kind of contemporaries attest to it, it was clear that a specter was haunting Europe. And it was not a specter of communism yet, but the specter of philosophical skepticism. And I'll explain why it's a specter just in a little bit. But the revival of this ancient Greek philosophy after the Reformation and its spread across a wide variety of disciplines in the 1600s would lay the foundation for this crisis of certainty, casting a long shadow over the European learned world. The skeptics call for a total suspension of judgment in all philosophical questions, first advocated here by Pyrrho of Elis in the 3rd century BCE, and then later recorded several centuries later in the texts of Sextus Empiricus in the 2nd century of the Common Era, was based on the assumption that the mind was incapable of obtaining true and certain knowledge of the surrounding world, or of its own operations. In other words, we couldn't know if the senses depicted the world to us as it really was, and whether our minds were simply playing tricks on us and producing illusions. So philosophical skepticism, or often in this period commonly referred to as Pyrrhonism after Pyrrho, was a coherent yet diverse set of philosophical, or one might say anti-philosophical opinions that became fashionable among European savants over the course of the 17th century, reaching its apex of popularity at the dawn of the so-called Age of Enlightenment in the early 1700s. Early modern skeptics doubted the existence of a reality that was independent of human perception, questioned long-standing philosophical assumptions, and at times undermined established political, moral, and religious beliefs. It was in trying to overcome skeptical claims that Descartes had first proposed his rationalist epistemology, his rationalist theory of knowledge that began with, I think, therefore I am, and his hyperbolic doubt that led him to conclude that he was because he thought, was itself an attempt to beat the skeptics at their own game, to engage in this kind of deep dive into doubt and to emerge with something that was certain. Now, it's really kind of impossible to understand the development of modern philosophy without considering the revival of the different forms of ancient skepticism, because it really affected a variety of fields, from epistemology, that is theory of knowledge, to theology and ethics, natural philosophy, or what we call science, and even political theory, jurisprudence, and historiography, as I'll talk about today at the end of my talk. The revival and spread of skepticism coincided also with, of course, a turbulent period in European history, which made it an especially appealing school of thought for many thinkers. One only has to think of, for example, the religious wars and upheavals of the Reformation that engulfed Europe in religious wars for a century and a half. The growing kind of philosophical uncertainty that resulted from the breaking of the Aristotelian monopoly on higher education. Escalating global warfare, not only kind of wars of religion, but wars of empire throughout Europe and the New World. And also, of course, an increasingly globalized world that led people to encounter a very dramatically different peoples, different cultures, and different customs. So with this in mind, with this context in mind, skeptical arguments then provided important intellectual resources for trying to make sense of this increasingly uncertain world in the 16 and 1700s. Skepticism also then became a tool for criticizing one's philosophical opponents and attacking each other's systems. It also simultaneously offered a refuge from commitments to any given philosophical school by arguing that all philosophical schools did not lead us to any significant degree of certainty. So there were two main forms of ancient skepticism that worth noting. First was academic skepticism, which is named after Plato's Academy and was first articulated by thinkers Arcesilaus and Carneades. They challenged the absolute certainty of knowledge while suggesting that one could establish relative probabilities. And in the ancient Greek context, this happened also when during the contest between the Stoics, the Epicureans, all these schools, the skeptics identified as dogmatists. That is, that they provided a dogma and kind of a coherent set of opinions that they claimed to be true and certain. So anybody who's a dogmatist in the language of the skeptics is somebody who is claiming to propose something about the way the world is and the way that you should act. And the skeptics argued that no knowledge was certain. For the academics, everything was kind of relatively probable. So they said that neither sense perception nor human reason were reliable faculties for establishing anything about the world with certainty. Since nothing was certain, according to the academics, all knowledge was merely probable. And you could then establish degrees of probability about the world. The academics were the less radical of the two forms of ancient skepticism. Because of that, because they argued that some things could be more probable than others. And as we'll see in the story, their claims would then appeal to thinkers who did not accept the full conclusions of philosophical skepticism, and particularly of the second branch, the more radical branch, and that is Pyrrhonian skepticism, named after our friend Pyrrho. For Pyrrhonians, everything was uncertain. So the kind of the proposition you can offer to identify Pyrrhonian skepticism is as follows. We cannot know anything with certainty, including the proposition that we cannot know anything with certainty. So for the Pyrrhonians, the academic claim that there were degrees of probability and some things were more probable than others was itself dogmatic, right? Because it's a claim about some things appear to be more closer to the truth than others. And for the Pyrrhonians, that itself required you to have a criterion of truth that you needed to have in order to identify what's more probable and what's less probable. But of course, you didn't have that in the Pyrrhonian system. So they and as all kind of ancient schools, the goal ultimately wasn't just to articulate a vision of the world, but also to have a moral component. And what the Pyrrhonian skeptics advocated was kind of a total suspension of judgment on all philosophical and all questions, really, that was supposed to lead one to achieve tranquility or ataraxia. And it was in the 2nd century of the Common Era that Sextus Empiricus formalized these tenets of Pyrrhonian skepticism. We don't have Pyrrho's writings. We don't even know that he wrote anything. We only know about him through the ancient thinker Diogenes Laertius, who wrote the lives of philosophers who would have accounts of different ancient thinkers that existed. And in these stories, Pyrrho would be presented as kind of this ridiculous figure who he doubted that anything was real. So you'd have stories about him trying to cross the street as all these chariots are going by, and his students are trying to pull him away from being run over by a chariot. Or you would have him kind of be walking with a friend, and the friend suddenly falls into a ditch, and he continues walking and talking as if nothing happened, right? So he really, in these stories, he acted as if his philosophy were true, and that kind of caricature that Diogenes Laertius presented about Pyrrho became kind of widely associated with skepticism when it was being presented as this kind of ridiculous philosophy that nobody could really think and act in this way. But nevertheless, Sextus Empiricus formalized the teachings, what he believed to be the teachings of Pyrrho. And then in the 16th century, his works would be found and then translated into Latin. It was thanks primarily to French humanist thinker and philosopher Michel de Montaigne, who was kind of most responsible for first reading that translation and then popularizing it in his very widely read essays. You might have come across him in discussions of like the most famous essays probably on the cannibals, where he discusses the Tupinamba tribe in South America, about which he read, but then kind of makes a comparison to the wars of religion in Europe, and asks kind of Europeans to reflect on their own violence. But the central part of the essays, which are in 3 volumes, the second part has this long text, which is the Apology of Raymond Sebond, which deals with questions of whether we can know religious truths with certainty, and this is where Montaigne laid out his popularization of Pyrrhonism. And given the context of the Reformation, he retooled ancient Pyrrhonism, making its tenets applicable to both modern philosophy and to the confessional debates of the present. So, in the context of kind of Protestants writing against Catholics and Catholics writing against Protestants, and Montaigne himself a Catholic, but helped to negotiate peace settlements in France during the latter part of the 16th century. The skepticism again offered a kind of refuge where the Protestants could say, well, the Catholics are merely human authorities and they're fallible and they cannot advance anything dogmatic with certainty. Similarly, Catholics deployed skeptical arguments against claims of all knowledge of kind of the religious truths come from Scripture alone, showing that the human mind was not strong enough to even kind of describe the world around itself, much less to understand religious truth. So it kind of could be a double-edged sword and could play both ways. And so Montaigne started this tradition of Christian Pyrrhonism, or fideism, fide being derived from the word faith, that provided a model then for many 17th century thinkers who would marshal skeptical philosophy in defense of Christianity against religious rationalist critiques. They would argue in the face of deist critiques of the Scriptures and of the kind of supernatural miracles, that the faith in Christian miracles and doctrines did not contradict rational explanations, but kind of stood that faith and reason essentially were very different faculties and should operate within different domains. That the fundamental articles of Christianity, the fideists like Montaigne argued, should be accepted on faith alone. And again, this became kind of a popular school that other thinkers identified with this. Another thinker would be Blaise Pascal, who offered the famous wager in the 17th century. But the most prominent person at the time who took up this school of fideistic skepticism was the Huguenot, the Protestant thinker Pierre Bayle, who was he was born a Catholic, he was born a Calvinist, briefly converted to Catholicism, only to reconvert back to Calvinism 9 months later, which made him a criminal in France. So he had to flee France to first Switzerland, and then eventually to Rotterdam in the Dutch Republic, where he settled and began composing learned journals. But most importantly, his historical and critical dictionary, which it's probably the most famous book most of you have never heard of. It was the most widely owned text in French libraries of the 18th century. Before the Encyclopédie, it was the encyclopedia of the Enlightenment. Yeah. Oh, sorry, it should be 1647. I'm sorry. So he died in 706, but 1647. Yeah, sorry, that was. And so the book was before the Encyclopédie, which had multiple authors. The historical and critical dictionary was like an 18th century Wikipedia that many people read as much for kind of information as they did for kind of curiosity and entertainment. And what it would do is it would have the main entry on the top of the page, and it was like a folio, so it was roughly this size. And it would have the main entry that would have the essential information, and then it would have various footnotes that went on digressions and different accounts, and that's where he would put a lot of the kind of controversial, licentious stuff that the dictionary would be condemned for in France and in other places. But a number of articles questioned the rational foundations of religion, showing how incapable human reason was at resolving various theological questions, most particularly the problem of evil and the issue of free will that bothered kind of Bayle so much, who himself, historians argue whether he was a believer or not, but it seemed that he was very preoccupied with kind of resolving the question of theodicy as the problem of evil. And also at the same time, he kind of attacked the new science, new natural philosophy, showing kind of various contradictions inherent in the philosophies of Locke and Descartes, in kind of atomism, and other kind of natural philosophical propositions. So in part because of the dictionary, and many thinkers would attempt to kind of write refutations of Bayle or compose their own anti-dictionaries. So by the early 1700s, it was clear to contemporaries that skepticism was haunting their learned world. And skepticism was a specter precisely because the skeptical arguments were not always advanced by actual skeptics like Bayle. They were often, at this time, conjured up by thinkers who tried to establish more certain foundations of knowledge against imagined skeptical interlocutors. So you constantly see this motif in treatises where people are writing kind of a treatise on a theory of knowledge or on the question of, say, animal souls, which they wrote a lot on this period. And they would try to then ask, okay, what kind of objections might a skeptic philosopher make, and how might I advance a philosophical system that would be able to overcome these objections. And often, again, they would kind of internalize the voices of the skeptics. And so when I began this book, I wanted to understand how the intellectual culture went from this profound crisis of confidence in the early 1700s to this kind of supposed age of reason that characterized the latter half of the 18th century. And so I explored how Enlightenment thinkers tried to grapple with this crisis of philosophical confidence and try to define what it meant to be certain, reasonable, and rational. And I guess my conclusion was that, though we often associate the Enlightenment with that confidence in the powers of the human understanding, the scholarship tends to overlook the fact that thinkers of this period continued to, throughout the 18th century, grapple with the challenge of philosophical skepticism. And it was through complex and prolonged engagements with the claims of skepticism in the 18th century that thinkers ultimately came to redefine the powers and demarcate the limits of human reason. So skeptical claims forced philosophers to formulate principles and assumptions that they considered to be mostly certain or at least highly probable. And so they started to articulate new rules for attaining true and certain knowledge, but also define boundaries beyond which human reason was not supposed to venture. The debates also transformed skepticism by somewhat mitigating its arguments and kind of re-emphasizing the academic position, the academic skeptical position in these debates. So ultimately, I think the debates between the skeptics and their opponents then are at the heart of the origin story of modern conception of reason, and they help to explain why certain forms of rationality came to be privileged over others. In particular, this kind of emphasis on what anti-skeptical thinkers would identify with common sense, reasonableness, probability, and verisimilitude, that is similar to the truth. And so the reformulation about of the assumptions about the extent and limits of rational understanding produced a sort of epistemological middle ground between absolute certainty on the one hand and absolute doubt on the other, and allowed thinkers to distinguish between questions that could be debated productively and those that would result in endless and unending debates. So far from having this great confidence in the powers of human reason, the most vocal opponents of the skeptics were deeply aware of the limits of human understanding, and many of them chose what are called practicable reason, concerned with phenomena that affected matters deemed to be practical and useful, over speculative or abstract reason that dealt with abstract metaphysical notions. So in the rest of today's talk, I'd like to focus on two particular case studies. First, I'll look at how the debates about the mind-body problem reshaped 18th century theory of knowledge, and then I will very briefly explain how skepticism transformed approaches to the study of history. And finally, I'll conclude with reflections on the historical significance of this process, and then very briefly reflect on how 18th century debates about skepticism remain very relevant today. So starting with epistemology and the mind-body problem. So again, epistemology is theory of knowledge, right? Might use the word, but just so that it's easier to say epistemology than to say theories of knowledge. The skeptics' most fundamental arguments in favor of a suspension of judgment involved a critical examination of first the mental faculties and two of the senses, right? Those were the main kind of there was a two-pronged argument. They claimed that the human mind was unreliable and inconstant, in part because it was affected by bodily dispositions, right? So when you're sick, your mind doesn't work as well as when you're healthy, right? When you have too much coffee, your mind races. When you had not enough coffee, or when you're sleepy, right, you can't do math well. And they also argued that the senses represented the world inaccurately, giving a variety of examples, right? So the moon and the sun appear the same size to us, though if we know that they're not. When you put a stick into water, it appears bent, even though it continues to be straight. So there are all sorts of ways in which the senses deceive us. And they also offered a number of logical paradoxes showing how reason kind of entraps itself in its own labyrinths. So by questioning the possibility of obtaining true and certain knowledge through the senses, and by pointing to the fallibility of the mental processes, they insisted that we withhold all conclusions on all questions. And so to answer these questions, philosophers then had to come up with theories of knowledge that could withstand such scrutiny and explain how the senses and the mind could actually arrive at probable or certain knowledge. So Descartes' famous dictum, "I think, therefore I am," as well as his dualist theory of mind-body interaction, aim to provide one such answer to philosophical skepticism. However, by proposing this essential distinction between, on the one hand, the immaterial mind, and on the other hand, the material body, Descartes then created a set of philosophical, theological, and physiological problems that stimulated heated debates for over 100 years after his death. So while the distinction between the immaterial mind and the extended body allowed Descartes and his followers to offer a philosophical demonstration of the immortality of the soul, the dualist conception most fundamental problems for the theory of knowledge. So in Descartes' conception, the world is made up of two substances. Either it's matter, which is just extension, everything that's extended physical, and mind, which is fundamentally different. It's immaterial, or mind or the soul, they're immaterial. They don't occupy any space. And that's how you can offer an explanation of the soul being immortal, because something that's immaterial is imperishable. Boom, there you go. That dedicates his meditations to the Faculty of Theology at the Sorbonne, saying, I've provided a new philosophical demonstration of the immortality of the soul. But the problem for Descartes, and then later for his followers, as well for everyone else, was how to explain the relationship between these two categorically distinct substances. How is it that they interact with each other? And Descartes himself kind of struggled with this, suggesting at one point that the soul had no specific location in the body, but then arguing that the pineal gland was the seat of the common sense, and also suggesting that it was the principal seat of the soul and the place in which all our thoughts were formed. So it seemed that then this immaterial being had a material presence in the body. And so the ambiguity in Descartes' own views then prompted debates among his various disciples, all of whom embraced some form of substance dualism. And the tension between the theories of the separation of mind and matter and the explanation of how they interact then elicited various attempts to resolve this apparent difficulty. And for the skeptics who seized on this, the problem itself was a prime example of the weakness of the human mind that failed not only to understand the surrounding world, but even to account for its own operations. So the various attempts to resolve this mind-body interaction then would either prove philosophically inconsistent or theologically dangerous, as we'll see. One possible solution, set of solutions, involved explanations that proposed that two substances did not interact at all. And these came from Nicolas Malebranche and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, both of whom kind of saw themselves as disciples of Descartes or commentators on Descartes. So while some Cartesians downplayed the consequences of dualism by stressing the intimate union between the mind and the body, Malebranche and Leibniz took the mind-body distinction to one of its logical conclusions by insisting that there could not be any formal interaction between the two distinct substances. So they proposed we won't have a quiz on how these work, but just kind of examples. So Malebranche proposed the theory of occasionalism, in which God constantly intervened. So in Malebranche's system, my seeing the chair or my seeing the carpet did not result in me having the idea of the carpet. My senses kind of gave me a rudimentary knowledge of the world around me, so I wouldn't bump into things like the podium, but it was really God who ensured that the mental world and the physical world constantly corresponded to each other in his system. So there was no effect between the material and the immaterial. For Leibniz, it was kind of a similar explanation, except for rather than constantly making sure that me and all of us have that constancy of our mental and physical worlds corresponding, for Malebranche, there's a pre-established harmony by which God established the world and the substances happen to correspond this way. So basically, in modern parlance, created a code, right, in which, by which then the mental and the physical world would be in sync. And the example provided by Leibniz himself demonstrated here is you have these two synchronized watches, right? So how these watches have no contact with each other, so how to make sure that they remain synchronized. In each case, God was involved to make sure that there was a correspondence between one's ideas of the world and that objective reality of the world. Other thinkers question the existence of the material world altogether and argued that everything we experience exists only in the mind. Bishop George Berkeley, the Irish philosopher after whom Berkeley is named, I don't know why they pronounce it differently, but his name is Berkeley, insisted that the only way to overcome skeptical critiques was by establishing the foundation of all knowledge on a purely idealist basis. So since one, for Berkeley, couldn't prove the existence of anything outside the mind, it was reasonable to assume that there was nothing in the world other than ideas. For Berkeley, skepticism followed, quote, from our supposing a difference between things and ideas, and that the former have a subsistence without the mind. He noted that the skeptics themselves had always pointed to the inability of establishing a causal connection between the two, and argued that the doctrine of matter had been, quote, the main pillar in support of skepticism, atheism, and irreligion. As long as philosophers attribute a real existence to unthinking things, that is to say, an actuality distinct of their being perceived, he argued, they would never be able to verify their existence outside the mind and would end up becoming skeptics. So while Berkeley's immaterialist system proposed to resolve the problem of the interaction between the two substances and provide a new explanation of the origin ideas, it led many of his critics to accuse him of surreptitiously promoting skepticism, even though, as you can see in the title of the text, he's actually trying to refute skepticism. His denial of an actuality of an external material world undermined those who wished to prove the existence of God based on the perfection of the creation, and that was a common argument for proving the existence of God, was that if you look at the immensity and the order in the world, from the effects you can infer a cause. And so Berkeley's system kind of undid all that in trying to disprove the skeptics. Furthermore, some suggested that Berkeley's propositions rendered God a deceiver, something Descartes took up as well, who had led human beings to mistakenly believe in the existence of a world that corresponded to their ideas. So you have, this is the second solution, I guess, immaterialism. Other solution involved arguing that the soul was in some way material, and thus able to interact with the body physically. So that, again, drawing on that notion in Descartes that the soul seat was somewhere in the pineal gland. Although John Locke seemed to endorse a dualist conception of human nature throughout his essay concerning human understanding, he explicitly did not rule out the possibility that matter could be capable of thought. It was impossible to know, he argued, whether God, quote, had given to matter fitly disposed a power to perceive and think, or else joined and fixed to matter so disposed a thinking immaterial substance. The two options were, so either there are two substances that interact, or whether the matter can actually think. The two options from a perspective of divine omnipotence are equally easy, right? If you're an omnipotent being, and this often gets invoked in all of these debates, just as easy to create a material substance that thinks as it is to create two substances, one of which thinks, one of which doesn't, that interact, right? There's no, one thing can be more difficult than the other. And although Locke made the suggestion in the context of explaining the limits of human understanding, his argument implicitly then pitted divine omnipotence against the common conception of matter as being inert, inactive, and incapable of mental operations, which the majority of thinkers at the time endorsed. Locke didn't necessarily think that thought could be a property of matter, but he couldn't rule out the possibility that an omnipotent being operated in ways that were not fully understandable to human beings. And while Locke himself did not necessarily belabor this claim, his later interpreter Voltaire appropriated the statement and made it central to his presentation of Locke's philosophy in his philosophical letters from 1734, where Voltaire quoted the famous passage regarding the materiality of the soul, and then described the uproar it elicited among theologians, and then defended Locke against accusations of irreligion. And I'll come back to Voltaire in just a second. And some thinkers did voice explicit dissatisfaction with the philosophical and theological consequences that followed from this doctrine of substance dualism that Descartes had inaugurated. The Swiss philosopher Gaspard Quenz, not pictured, he's very, very obscure, can't find his picture, figured, and we won't be with him for long, but he accused the systems of Descartes, Malebranche, Leibniz of helping to promote skepticism and irreligion inadvertently. According to him, the arguments for total immateriality of the soul seem to contradict common experience. And he thought that such hypotheses threw into uncertainty those who would otherwise be receptive to self-evident proofs of the soul's immortality, thereby inadvertently increasing the ranks of the skeptics. And Quentz claimed Locke's principles as his inspiration, and he argued that the soul could be both material and immortal at the same time. He also proposed that the soul was a non-extended being that was incapable of thinking of, or that he argued that a non-extended being couldn't act on the body, again emphasizing the fact that the soul needed to be somewhat material, and then described it as a spiritual body. So while his views are very eccentric and contrary to most accepted theological and philosophical opinions at the time, they did present a sincere attempt to resolve the question of mind-body interaction, while also attempting to provide an explanation for the immortality of the soul. And the goal, again, for Quentz was to provide this account and argue against the skeptics. But he kind of remained within the theological mainstream, or at least tried to preserve the fundamental principles of Christianity against potential skeptical arguments. Not all attempts to resolve the mind-body problem endeavored to accommodate Christian theology, however, and by the middle of the 18th century, Julien Offray de la Métrie put forth an explicitly anti-theological theory of the soul in his materialist hypotheses, and he authored both Man and Machine and also the Natural History of the Soul, works that got him banished from France and then from the very liberal Netherlands at the time, and he ended up at the court of Frederick the Great in Potsdam in Prussia. And so he argued that he presented examples of the intimate interdependence of the soul and body, suggesting that it was impossible to speak of the soul without taking physiology into account. He argued that since all the faculties of the soul depend on the power and organization of the brain, and that then all thought develops with the organs, all evidence pointed to the fact that the soul was not distinct from, but heavily dependent on the body. So La Métrie's solution to the problem of dualism was as radical as Berkeley's, though it presented a totally materialist conception of the soul. La Métrie denounced what he saw as pointless metaphysical speculations that claimed to provide certainty while in actuality obscuring the matter further. His view reflected a growing dissatisfaction with abstract metaphysical philosophy that became apparent in the writings of other Enlightenment philosophers by the middle of the 18th century. The question of how the immaterial and immortal soul interacted with the material and perishable body, and the theological implications of the answers to this fundamental problem, were at the heart of these protracted debates. The result, in the French-speaking intellectual world at least, was this gradual yet steady frustration with metaphysics and the acceptance of probable explanations as the only attainable goal. So, and this growing discontent with metaphysics and abstract philosophy in its approach to the mind-body problem led to explicitly anti-metaphysical theories of knowledge. So some philosophers like Voltaire denounced the entire enterprise of attempting to understand the nature and the composition of the soul. Let me just quickly summarize. So we have 4 different kinds of attempts to metaphysical attempts to answer. Right? We have that there's no interaction. So God is involved, but that impacts free will. We have kind of an immaterialist account that everything's in the mind. We have an account that that the soul is purely material, and then we have this kind of fourth one that refuses to embrace any of these, but embraces kind of this idea that we can't really know what the soul is, and that's where we get to philosophers like Voltaire. So in his letter on Locke that described the philosophy of Locke, he quoted the English philosopher's reply to critics, saying, "At least confess yourselves to be as ignorant as I. As you cannot comprehend either matter of spirit, why would you presume to assert anything about them?" Voltaire presented Locke's admission of ignorance not as a philosophical failure, but as a virtue, contrasting the English philosopher's intellectual humility with the presumptuous attempts to define the essences of spirit and matter. He predicted that the subject would never be resolved because, quote, human reason is so little able to demonstrate by itself the soul's immortality. And we see similar attempts, similar kind of claims in other prominent Enlightenment works. So the Encyclopédie's article, Soul, enumerated various ancient and modern opinions on the nature of the soul. And the co-authors, Claude Yvon and the philosopher Denis Diderot, suggested that the article would never be finished if all the various propositions were to be summarized, all the various opinions of the ancients and moderns about the soul. They claimed that while common experience pointed to an obvious interdependence between the soul and body, it was impossible to establish clearly where and how the two interacted with each other. The discussion of the origins of ideas in the article Idea in the Encyclopédie proved rather inconclusive, noting that the subject was, quote, something that will probably always remain unknown to us and would always be open to conjectures. Such declarations reflected gradual concessions to the major claims of skepticism. Unable to refute the Pyrrhonian skeptics philosophically, their opponents agreed that a reasonable or mitigated skepticism was an acceptable alternative, both to dogmatism and to complete doubt in irresolvable questions such as the essence of spirit and matter. These debates produced then a dramatic shift from a search for metaphysical or absolute certainty to an increased emphasis on what contemporaries called moral certainty, also verisimilitude and probability. And that's the kind of distinction between the two. So metaphysical certainty, is something like 2 + 2 = 4, or the angles of a triangle have to add up to 180. Moral certainty that they invoked was something that had a high degree of probability and couldn't be doubted by anyone who reasoned sincerely, but was not akin to metaphysical certainty. So, like, I guess a question that came up among contemporaries. David Hume, poses this philosophical problem that nobody's technically able to answer with complete metaphysical certainty of we don't know whether the sun will rise tomorrow, right? We can say with a high degree of moral certainty that it will because it has risen every day for that, but we don't know for certain that it will, right? So that's and most people, they could argue that, well, how do you know that it will? But, if you were to, and this is an argument that anti-skeptical thinkers would make, if you're willing to bet them $1,000 on the fact that the sun will rise tomorrow, they're probably not going to take your bet, right? Or another argument they would make, and again, these are sort of practical refutations of skepticism rather than theoretical ones. They would say, well, if you steal a skeptic's money, he's not going to sit there and argue about whether money is real. He's going to try and chase the thief, right? So these kinds of claims, so moral certainty would be increasingly invoked. And so many thinkers then accepted the virtual unattainability of metaphysical certainty while maintaining that moral certainty could still be secured in a majority of questions. So anti-skeptical thinkers invoked this principle as well as self-evidence or common sense to suggest that there were basic knowable truths that could not be doubted or that it was simply impractical to doubt. The Encyclopédie's article, Pyrrhonism, about Pyrrhonian skepticism, called for pragmatic limitations on the ambitions of both human reason and on skepticism. Diderot argued that reason had to be applied soberly, and sometimes one needed to end disputations in order to avoid floating in uncertainty. And the article Verisimilitude distinguished between speculative questions where one ran no risk of suspending judgment and practical matters in which one had to accept whatever appeared to be probable and to as true and to act upon it. In the latter case, inaction would be the most pernicious of all sides. And at this point in the middle of the 18th century, even authors of religious apologetics argued that in some cases one had to resort to verisimilitude and probability in religious debates in order to convince unbelievers both of the extremely probable existence of God and the probable truth of Christianity. So probability and verisimilitude then would become acceptable options in cases where absolute certainty could not be obtained. The Encyclopédie's preliminary discourse, authored by d'Alembert, address the question in the following way. It kind of opens with this long digression about the origin of human ideas. And D'Alembert wrote, let us therefore believe without wavering that our sensations do in fact have the cause outside ourselves that we suppose them to have, because the effect that can result from the real existence of that cause could not differ in any way from the effect that we experience. Far from wishing to cast shadows over a truth recognized even by the skeptics when they're not engaged in debates, let us leave the trouble of working out its principle to the enlightened metaphysicians. In other words, D'Alembert dismissed the importance of abstract speculations about epistemology and the theory of knowledge, leaving the disputes up to those who considered the philosophical resolution to the question important. The implication, of course, was that any such solution did not in no way affect their ability to discuss the source and nature of ideas on a purely practical level. Skeptical doubts about the correspondence between ideas and objects, as well as theoretical speculations about the nature of the soul in this process, were irrelevant and even distracting for D'Alembert and his fellow 18th century philosophers. So that's the case study one with the mind-body problem. I'm going to switch to case study two, which will go by much faster, and talk about historical skepticism, which again emerged as this phenomenon in the late 17th, early 18th century. You see constant references to historical Pyrrhonism or historical skepticism in literature surrounding kind of historiographical debates and in literature on jurisprudence. So the revival and spread of philosophical skepticism in the early modern period also transformed humanist disciplines, not just philosophy, and had a particular effect on history. Debates about historical certainty had been a prominent topic since the ancient Greeks, or even more so since the Renaissance. Humanists began to develop critical methods of source analysis. And of course, the polemical disputes of the Reformation had injected new explosive debates about things like church history. But the debates of the late 17th and early 18th centuries combine these previous concerns with a systematic critique of all received traditions and established epistemological assumptions. So philosophical skepticism then added kind of a new wrinkle, a new dimension to debates, and had a transformative effect on the practice of history. Skeptics questioned methods of historical scholarship, cast doubts on the reliability of respected authors, and denied the very possibility of obtaining true and certain knowledge of the past. And then again, in particular, the main culprit was Pierre Bayle and his historical and critical dictionary that played a most important role in perpetuating this crisis of historical consciousness in the late 1600s. By condemning what he saw as fictitious and biased accounts of ancient and more recent events, Bayle and other skeptics both disputed the veracity of received historical knowledge and contested established historiographical methods for obtaining that knowledge. So again, a two-pronged attack. In light of skeptical critiques, historians and scholars tried to redefine the nature of reliable evidence, to establish firmer methodologies for evaluating that evidence, and also became more critical toward authorities that had been considered practically infallible. Historians also began to rely on new kinds of sources, particularly non-textual ones, and to formalize rules and procedures for establishing relative certainties of past events. Such attempts at formalizing rules rendered the historical practice more professional and also transformed the historian's role, amplifying the scholar's moral responsibility to examine sources with greater scrutiny. Thinkers on both sides of the debate increasingly also accepted probability as a pragmatic middle ground between complete certainty and extreme skepticism. This dialogical or dialectical process thus facilitated the gradual modernization of the practice of history and paved the way for it to assume this kind of quasi-scientific status in the 19th century. So philosophical skepticism, again, played a crucial role in changing approaches to historiography in a period when Europeans were becoming conscious about their own place in the process of historical development. And 18th century treatises are, again, full of these kind of accounts of stadial theories of human development and where the current period stands. The debates about the methods and value of historical scholarship were most lively in the French Royal Academy of Inscriptions and Letters, and that's my next project is about this academy, but I came across them first when reading about their debates about historical skepticism. The academy was established along other scientific and literary academies in the late 17th century. This institution was charged with locating ancient monuments, coins, medals, and inscriptions that could be used as models for commemorating the military achievements and triumphs of Louis XIV. So at first it was kind of meant to be this propaganda academy for creating, one of the earliest projects was creating medals and coins that commemorated his achievements, on the model of kind of ancient Roman coins. And it's housed right now across the Pont des Arts from the Louvre, where all of the academies are now housed, but it originally would meet in the Louvre itself. The Academy's members study the history of ancient and medieval societies, as well as increasingly those of non-European civilizations. And the unearthing of Chinese and Indian sources confirmed previous claims from the 17th century that the Bible did not provide an account of universal history. It was increasingly apparent that civilizations like China and India seemed to predate the scriptural timeline in their own writings. Of course, Voltaire popularized this idea in his essay on universal history from 1756, but it was the Academy's members who provided much of the original research on this question. So the work of the academicians is kind of unsettled established beliefs about the past and contributed to the growing crisis of historical certainty. In 1717, the Academy of Inscriptions began publishing a periodical journal, and the 1729 issue dedicated most of the 800-page volume to a series of debates about skepticism and certainty of ancient history. And so the academicians staked out radically different positions about the possibility of obtaining reliable information about ancient history, and also clashed regarding the methods that should be used to gather knowledge about the remote and more recent past. The most basic assault on the possibility of obtaining true and certain historical knowledge came from skeptics who pointed to the absence or relative paucity of sources from antiquity and suggested that there was little evidence outside of mythological narratives to establish any facts. Their opponents and the self-proclaimed defenders of historical certainty, the fides historica is the Latin term for it, disputed the absence of primary sources that could attest to the history of ancient civilizations and suggested that a sufficient number of primary documents were still available. Some noted that although textual evidence about antiquity could be maybe sparse, significant discoveries could be made through the study of non-textual evidence, including ruins, statues, pottery, coins, tablets, and other materials. Such material evidence could corroborate the accuracy of certain written accounts. The study of structures like city walls and columns and statues could also provide important information about the nature and progress of ancient civilizations, even in places where no written sources remained. The anti-skeptical thinkers argued that even if modern historians did not have direct access to primary written sources from early antiquity, they could infer the existence of those materials from the descriptions in the accounts of ancient historians. And some argue that even ancient myths and seeming exaggerations did not necessarily undermine the fundamental truth of the events recounted and could provide certain details or this picture of events with some degree of accuracy. And there was a whole school of mythography that kind of emerged in this time that tried to read myths as historical sources. Vico is probably the most famous one of these figures. Many skeptics also pointed to the bias of historians. They claimed that the accuracy of most historical accounts could not always be assumed. Some blamed emotions and prejudices for corrupting historical narratives, laying particular stress on the common tendency to attribute false glory to one's own country and to make fictitious claims out of enmity for other nations. So Pierre Bayle himself, who wrote a commentary on the history of the wars of religion, suggested that all historical scholarship suffered from the problem of partisanship. And he wrote, quote, "Consequently, the same facts and the same events became entirely different because each author attempted to show that right, reason, and truth were on the side of his party," suggesting that it was impossible to have an objective history of the wars of religion because each would be tainted with a partisan or confessional bias. Most scholars did concede that a significant number of sources on which many historians of antiquity had relied contained fundamental problems, and that blind agreement, even with the most respected authors and authorities, was unbefitting a serious student of the past. Seeking to avoid what they called the road to ignorance paved by the skeptics who subjected all knowledge of the past to doubt, the defenders of historical certainty then had to disentangle reliable accounts from questionable ones. So as a result, the practice of source criticism occupied an increasingly important place in debates about historiography, resulting in the development of rules and procedures for analyzing primary sources and evaluating reliability of ancient and modern historians. And again, you have these manuals that emerged at this time that lay out sort of rule number 1, rule number 2, and establish relative accuracy of accounts based on like whether it came from somebody who was an eyewitness to the events or somebody who spoke to an eyewitness, and the further removed, less reliable the source. So kind of things that we take for granted were formalized at this time. The interaction then between skeptical arguments and those who try to overcome them produced a limited compromise about the extent and limits of historical knowledge. Both sides agree that while there were some basic things about the past that could be known with almost complete certainty, the level of detail of this information varied dramatically depending on the availability and the quality of sources. So in light of apparent historical inaccuracies and uncertainties, a growing number of historians advocated, again, kind of a mitigated skepticism in history and argued that there was a place for reasonable doubts in all investigations of the past. And many historians began to stake out a middle way between the two perceived extremes of accepting all plausible historical accounts as true, one hand, and rejecting all history as false and uncertain on the other. So again, they accepted probability and verisimilitude as constructive compromises. And I just have two quick examples. So Louis-Jean Lévesque de Pouilly, one of the academicians who had argued against the certainty of the possibility of knowing early Roman history with certainty, nevertheless suggested that one could arrive at a high degree of probability by analyzing both the internal logic of historical facts and the credibility of authorities that reported them. He argued that it would be unreasonable to doubt every event to which one was not a direct eyewitness. He also urged fellow historians to take the middle road, arguing, quote, let us oppose these excesses. Let us recognize that in histories, falsities are mixed with truths, but that there are marks by which we can distinguish one from the other. His opponent, historian Nicolas Frère, likewise claimed that historical demonstrations could reach a very high degree of probability, but they could never command complete metaphysical certainty, again, pointing to moral certainty. He argued that, quote, the sciences most important to man or to human beings, such as ethics, politics, economics, medicine, criticism, and jurisprudence, were incapable of obtaining the certainty identical to geometrical demonstrations and could never extend beyond great probability. However, Frère insisted, this probability has such a force in these matters that reasonable minds would never refuse to submit to it. So in other words, history as a human science could and should have its own standard of proof. So just as in the case of the disputes about the origins of ideas, the nature of the soul, as well as in the composition of matter and the structure of the universe, the debates about historical certainty drove scholarly discussions away from questions of metaphysical certainty and toward a practical search for the most probable version of past events. Rather than continuing ceaseless exchanges about the impossibility of entirely certain knowledge, defenders of historical certainty could then focus on refining and sharpening the methods of source criticism. And such a compromise proved profoundly useful for the discipline of history. Scholars could move away from attempting to disprove radical Pyrrhonian claims about absolute uncertainty of ancient history while appropriating and tactically deploying skeptical arguments to then improve their own craft. So much for the second case study, and I'll just wrap up with with a conclusion. Sorry if I've droned on for too long. These two case studies of 18th century theories of knowledge and historiography demonstrate how the debates between real and imagined skeptics on the one hand and their various opponents on the other led to a new conception of reason. Enlightenment thinkers emphasized reason's limits as much as they praised its powers. This allowed them to distinguish between questions that could be debated productively and speculations that would continue to entrap thinkers in the labyrinths of their own making. Philosophers like Diderot, Voltaire, and D'Alembert emphasized above all the practical importance of studying those things that were most directly related to human needs. They stressed the significance of what D'Alembert had called a reasonable metaphysics that offered principles and axioms that were as simple as axioms and that were the same for philosophers as they were for regular people. It was not speculative reason that they praised, but practicable reason, one that applied to concrete observations and calculations, not to abstract metaphysical debates. The first effect of this intellectual transformation was a shift in the topics the public discussed. Thinkers turned away from debates about epistemology, metaphysics, and other abstract philosophical topics and toward discussions of political organization, civil society, political economy, and morality, at least as far as broad public discourse was concerned. But it is noticeable if one looks at data people compiled back in the 20th century when quantitative history was a fad about what subjects are being published, and it changes dramatically between the late 17th century and the middle of the 18th century, where history and political economy take over as the major genres, whereas theology, metaphysics occupy an increasingly smaller portion of what's printed in learned journals and among treatises and so on. The second significant consequence was the growing acceptance of religious toleration. The willingness to admit ignorance and to suspend judgment allowed for the coexistence of a multiplicity of opinions and rival truth claims. And so the emerging belief that no single person, philosophical school, or religious authority could claim to know the absolute truth or to have the right to force it on others contributed to a sense of relativism in the religious and moral spheres during the second half of the 18th century. The combination of intellectual confidence and epistemological modesty that 18th century philosophy gave us remains one of its most enduring legacies today. The assumption that our knowledge of the world will continue to expand with each generation is almost axiomatic for all modern views about the powers and limits of the human understanding. Similarly, the willingness in most places to tolerate a multiplicity of competing philosophical, theological, political, and ethical perspectives, to suspend ultimate judgment until sufficient evidence becomes available, and to accept the possibility that one's conclusions may prove to be incorrect at some later point, are all at the heart of our modern mindset. This perspective questions the possibility of attaining any absolute truths about the world, and it places the practical needs of humanity at the center of a focused but unpresumptuous scientific inquiry. Now, these debates may seem quite remote to us, but the skeptical crisis faced by 18th century thinkers is eerily reminiscent of the crisis of certainty our culture faces today. I began this project long before terms like alternative facts began to be used by public officials, and long before doubts and uncertainties surrounding some of our key institutions, from the media to public health experts and elections, became kind of central to debates of our time. However, I think that the debates surrounding skepticism in the 18th century provide crucial examples and intellectual resources for how a culture can confront both uncertainty and misinformation. 18th century answers will not be our answers, but they do suggest that coming up with a solution to this crisis is both possible and quite necessary. Thank you. Get a pen really quick. I don't have a pen.
I will take some questions either online or in the room here. comments? I do have a question. I think you addressed it, but I might have gotten lost in it. Why was skepticism a specter for the Enlightenment?
Yeah, so a kind of a fascinating feature of the debates of this time is that you don't have that many people self-identifying as skeptics who are kind of writing. So aside from like someone like Bale or Hume, very few people are open skeptics. And yet throughout the philosophical literature and the historiographical literature, you constantly see the self-conscious attempt to deal with the problem of a potential skeptic. Like, what might a skeptic say? If I offer this explanation for how the mind and body interact, what objections should I anticipate? And it's important to kind of note that they're still coming out of this Aristotelian school of how you would debate questions. So when you taught at university, you were taught to answer objections. So you provide a series of propositions. Either you or someone else comes up with like objections, and you have to answer objections. So they're trained in this kind of dialectical model of philosophical reasoning. And so they're constantly coming up with objections that a skeptic might propose. So even if there aren't real skeptics proposing real problems, they are anticipating them in these imagined objections. So that's kind of why it's sort of looming over them as something they imagine might be a problem, even if it isn't.
And how might skepticism be a specter today?
Yeah, it's beyond my pay grade. Well, I think it's less of a specter today. I think it's, again, you have quite real debates about, like, very similar to kind of what Bale was pointing out to in the legacy of France coming out of the wars of religion, and how one talks about it in society that obviously experienced dramatic religious violence, but there's no kind of accountability. I mean, right? We're increasingly in a world, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, where you have, you have the growing popularity of like the flat Earth movement, right? Not just people doubting like the efficacy of vaccines, but like people who think that the Earth is flat, or people who embrace alternative facts or like radically different understandings. And so, depending on what media you are familiar with or consult, right, you get very different, almost like radically incompatible perceptions of reality. And so in some ways, it's not exactly skepticism, though there is a degree of that, as it is kind of these totally rival. So just as in the 18th century, they're trying to, imagine what the soul is like and have these radically different answers, kind of have a disagreement about what reality is like in some ways, in the political or cultural sphere.
Okay, we have a question here on Zoom. Shirley, go ahead.
This was fascinating, although I think Rick asked my question, but I guess it's safe to assume that women were not allowed to have any thoughts about reality or being, and still really, I guess, are not. But how do you account for the less religion today? Is this part of your skepticism? And how has knowledge of the brain and the mind and space exploration and those things brought any change to our thinking of reality?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think ultimately, intuitively, the answer that the French materialist thinker La Mettrie provided ended up being kind of the correct answer. We said it's theologians and philosophers should stop debating about the nature of the soul and have leave the problem to physiologists, to doctors. And so in some ways, right, what we know about the mind and the soul today demonstrates that, right, that it is physically, I mean, there does remain mystery about it, but there is an intimate interconnection between the mind and the body in a way that Cartesian dualism did not really adequately account for. I guess that answers part of it insofar as
help me with your statement. What we know about the soul today. What do we know about the soul today, from your opinion?
Oh, that's definitely beyond my. I mean, I think that's still among certain philosophical, like among contemporary philosophers. There's still a debate about, what the soul is. I mean, if one looks at like contemporary science fiction, right? There's the in the show Westworld, right? That the entire soul and someone's personality can be like uploaded into a little ball. But I think increasingly, or one opposite thing to what the 18th century did is the imagination of the soul as being more and more physical than in kind of something that can be almost, again, if one looks at like science fiction, right, that can be transported among the body. So in some sense, right, that the soul is kind of like data, but in another sense, I mean, I think it continues to be something that we resort to fiction to explain it because it cannot be fully explained. But I think we moved away from, at least in public discourse, debating that question.
Are you comfortable today with what you are explaining about historical concepts of being and everything, living in today's world?
No, not really. I've spent most of my time in the 17th and 18th century, so my musings on the like contemporary problems are, I advance them from the perspective of somebody who spends a lot of time in that time period. So I'm much less versed in that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep, if we want our Zoom people to hear.
I kept thinking during this. I'm trying to find a real life today practical use for this discussion other than mental gymnastics. And next in this time period came, I think, the Romantics, who felt that way about what came before. I remember a quote from Byron that said, "Hail Caesar," etc. And I'm tempted to say, "Hail skepticism," etc. And I know we don't have time to go with that, but for practical applications. And I was thinking about moral certitude, which I liked what you had to say. I read yesterday that many of the images coming from the Webb telescope refute the idea of the Big Bang, and many senior astrophysicists cannot explain what happened. Maybe it's always been, maybe the speed of light isn't, constant, but even something as certain as that isn't very certain. So maybe skepticism sort of should filter even hard science.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, right? That and ultimately the resolution in the 18th century, I think the practical outcome of it is, that if you embrace full skepticism, right, you're going to end up in a kind of I'm looking for a word, but I can't find it. But like you end up in a world that Berkeley imagined, basically, right, where everything is an illusion, nothing exists, and you're only in your own mind. Solipsism, that's the word. So you'd end up in this kind of solipsistic universe where you can't do anything. But a limited skepticism is also necessary, and I think what I said at the end about, right, that remaining open to the possibility that what we know about the world will change, and so never adopting a fully kind of dogmatic vision of, there was a Big Bang and that's how it happened and that's how it has to be. I mean, so these new discoveries will lead perhaps to the revision of a number of things we thought about the world that have changed since the 18th century. And I think that's where, having a kind of a healthy or mitigated skepticism, a moderate skepticism that questions theories that pretend to be overly certain, but then doesn't ultimately lead to a total collapse of kind of the possibility of knowing anything, is important, right? So being critical of one's sources of information, whether it's scientists, experts, political pundits, whatever, and kind of being open to kind of examining and re-examining evidence. I think that's kind of the practical import of the skeptical philosophy today and of how it was tamed in the Enlightenment. Yeah.
Any more questions or comments online or here? Well, let's thank Professor Matytsin,
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming today.
and thank you all again for attending all 7 lectures of this course. We really appreciate your participation and your thought. Thanks so much.
Thank you.